And technologies that offer a lot of degrees of freedom tend to wind up being used by leading edge adopters. And so Facebook is now bringing that to the masses, but the trade-off is that the people don't get the level of control. So what I find really interesting, I've seen Kynetx apps now that are interpolating themselves into Facebook and into Twitter, and I think that that's really significant because I think we're going to be getting to the point now where people are going to start to sense what the trade-off was and how can I get back the control that I've given away to Facebook. So in terms of programming the web, I started to do some things a while ago that started to look a little bit like Kynetx apps. And the first one was a thing that's now called library lookup. The idea was you're on an Amazon page, but the book that you're looking at is actually in your library. And in fact, it's on the shelf, and in fact, it's available, and in fact, you could check it out and read it for free. You don't need to buy the book on Amazon. So I did a little bookmark that would make that happen, and basically just take the ISBN out of Amazon, put it into your local library. And this was back in the web services era, right? This is like 2002 when we were writing all this stuff in InfoWorld about how these enterprise-grade web services were going to make this happy federation in the sky. And the dirty secret was it kind of wasn't happening, right? And meanwhile, this REST stuff was getting really interesting. So I was off on the side doing these kind of lightweight ad hoc mashups, and I was thinking, this is pretty good, right? I mean, this stuff's actually pretty easy. It doesn't have to be really hard. And this was when we sort of discovered that the web had an architecture, because who really knew, right? Turned out there was this guy Roy Fielding that had written a PhD thesis in 2000, and he laid out all these principles, and we slowly sort of rediscovered, or maybe discovered for the first time, what the web actually was, what its actual architectural framework was, and how it really meant to be about these kind of lightweight linked connections between things. I won't sort of drag you through the whole REST debate, but this idea of linked data, which is still something that Tim Berners-Lee is hoping to see happens in his lifetime, right? It keeps coming back around again. Phil mentioned OData, and I think that's a great example of it. So, it's a Microsoft initiative, but OData is really a set of conventions about using Atom and Atom Pub. And basically it's just a way of, it's a general purpose way of publishing data that can be consumed by any client. And, I guess you'll see later today a Kynetx app that is consuming the Netflix catalog through this OData interface and doing interesting mashups in the client based on that. Like watch the movie based on a connection that the app is making. So in a couple years later than that, like 2004, I was really getting into the Kynetx sweet spot with some of the things I was doing. So this is when I discovered and fell in love with Grease Monkey, which, if people don't know, it's a Firefox plugin that lets you do these in-browser mashups. And so I did a version of this that so there was a problem with the library lookup, which was that if you had an ISBN and you were trying to look up a book in the library, you might fail to find it because a book will actually have a dozen ISBNs, right? And so if you looked up the ISBN for the paperback, you wouldn't find the hardcover book. So an organization called OCLC, the Online Computer Library Consortium, did a service called XISBN. And XISBN was an example of what I think we're going to see a lot more of, which I call an equivalence service or a name reconciliation service. But what it did was say, if there are 13 ISBNs that all represent the same book, if you give me any one of them, I'll give you back all 13, right? So you can do an exhaustive lookup for this book. And so I was able to orchestrate all of that in Firefox, in Grease Monkey. So you would now look up the ISBN, it would go off to the OCLC, it would come back with the 13 ISBNs instead of the one, and then it would keep looking them up in the library until it did or didn't find one. Well, actually, I did two versions of that. I did one that ran in the cloud and one that ran in Grease Monkey. The thing about the Grease Monkey thing was that it was limited because, first of all, not everybody was using Firefox, and second of all, a really small number of Firefox users I found were really interested in installing Grease Monkey and installing Grease Monkey applications and in using them. So that was part of it, and that aspect of it is now, I think, largely resolved, right? So with technologies like jQuery, we're now in a position where what was a pretty niche thing to be doing 5 years ago is now it has the possibility of being completely ubiquitous, right? So you can now actually do this kind of stuff in a way that reaches, effectively everybody who matters. But what worried me about this page rewriting thing was that I started to think, is Jeff Bezos going to be okay with me, rewriting his page? Someone's on an Amazon page, and then the page is suddenly saying, hey, this book is actually available in your local library. Did you know that? And I was like, I think I can do that, but I don't know. Like, what would Jeff say? So I asked him one time, because I interviewed him, and he gave the right answer, which is, well, I think that, if you're sending people to Amazon for any reason, that it's going to increase our flow and we're going to engage more people. So I think it's just fine, and which is the right answer. But I think that, if like 95% of the people that were going to Amazon were having an alert pop up about the fact that the book was in their local library, it might get to be an issue, right? So, this is one of those things where this context stuff is I want to say it's a negotiation, right, amongst different parties, and the interests of those parties might or might not be aligned. And none of this has really been tested, right? And so this is just going to be an interesting thing going forward to see how it plays out. And it's I'll be interested to see how you folks are thinking about that particular issue, because I think it's going to get it's going to heat up, right? So, but anyway, I can remember probably 1991, and so early in the ascendancy of Windows as a dominant platform, a Microsoft executive came to me and said, guess what? We're the dominant platform right now, and this is how it's going to be forever. And maybe 5 years later, I remember being at the PDC, the Professional Developers Conference, and it was the Internet PDC, right? It was Microsoft like, here's how we connect to the internet. Here's all of our APIs, to do all this HTTP stuff, right? So, so that changed. And then I think it was last year I read something by Mark Andreessen. He made a very similar kind of comment, and he said basically on his blog, this HTML JavaScript thing, it's the platform. This is it, right? This is how it's going to be for the foreseeable and even unforeseeable future. And I'm thinking, no, it's not, right? And and then it's like, oh, it's all about the iPhone and the iPad. It's all going to be about the mobile device. It's like, no, right? It's not about any of these things, right? These things are all going to be in the environment, and we're going to want to be working with all of them. And the thing is to figure out sort of what is going to endure through generations of tech churn, because there just is endless amount of tech churn. And from the perspective of this conference, I sort of want to just end with three, I guess, principles that have been helpful to me in thinking about stuff. And so one of them is just the idea of defaults, right? So I mentioned, CSS, right? People don't tend to change the defaults. This is, I'm not much of a gadget person. This is actually my favorite new gadget, right? So it's a little USB stick, and there's nothing special about it except for the fact it's on my keychain, right? I don't know how many of these things I've lost, right? So now I've got a default, right? Like the default is I've got 4 gigs on my keychain, and it's always there, and I know where it is, right? And that's just a huge deal. So, we have I'll skip that. I'll skip the politics. No, just it's interesting, right? I mean, in the Obama administration, there are these people like Cass Sunstein who come from this behavioral economics point of view, and it's interesting how they're sort of learning some stuff from the technologists, and so they talk explicitly now about this idea of defaults, right? And so let's say a 401k plan, right? And the idea being, people will say that they want to save for retirement, right? But if they have to opt into their 401k, you find that mostly they don't do it, right? So, the administration is thinking, like, let's set the defaults up so people are just going to tend to be opted into these things, and then they can opt out, right? And it's just incredibly important. So, so how are you, how do you get this contextualization stuff to be the default, right? Is a really hard question and an interesting challenge.